Welcome, everybody. I'm Jane Wooldridge. I am with the Miami Herald, and I'm here with a terrific panel today. Our speakers are George H. Walker, Chairman and CEO of Neuberger Berman, who I think is coming to us from New York. We have Luis I'm so sorry about this, Almagro Lemes, Secretary General, Organization of the American States, James Bullard, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and Frank Holder, Chief Operating Officer of JS Held. And we're here to talk about mastering the economic revival. I think we are all ever aware that the pandemic was the black swan event that no one saw coming. I have friends on a number of boards who said that in all of their planning, none of them ever projected zero revenue, which is exactly the situation that many companies faced during lockdown. And while thankfully it looks like that dire situation is in the rearview mirror, the uneven vaccine rate and the Delta variant are reminders that we still may face challenges ahead, and getting ahead of those challenges and meeting them will take work for all. So to begin this morning, we are going to ask Mr. Holder, if you will please sort of set the table for us. What are you seeing globally in terms of the economic rebound at this point? What's this momentary temperature check?
So first of all, I'm very pleased to be on this panel with some very impressive people, and I'm sure they'll be able to dive deeper into a number of these issues. I'd say the economic we're seeing is both strong and asymmetrical. So we have the most robust post-recession recovery in the last 80 years. It looks like the world economy is going to grow almost 6% this year, maybe a little bit less. It's been a bit wobbly as of late due to Delta and some other factors in the supply chain. But we'll still be over 3% below pre-pandemic levels. The US and China are also making up a lion's share of this growth. About half of the growth is coming from those two markets. Emerging markets are growing, but they're struggling more than the developed economies, and that's why I say, when we talk about asymmetrical, there's a deviation of output issue, and some parts of the world, like Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, will likely not catch up to pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2022, whereas the rest of the world probably will. Some of the issues that we are seeing that are fueling concern have to do with inflation, particularly in food and energy. There are concerns about debt in the emerging world in particular, and access to vaccines, because obviously the pandemic is not over, even though we seem to have crossed a Rubicon in terms of at least living with it. So I would say, overall, a very, very strong economy, but some bumps in the road, some concerns when tapering actually starts occurring, some concerns with inflation, but probably not enough to have significant moves on interest rates in the bigger markets. But some of the smaller economies have already had to raise rates to combat headline inflation.
So when you think about key leading indicators, what are the ones that you're looking at? You've said that the US and China are pretty much full steam ahead, but what about some other markets? What will you be looking for as key indicators to say this place, this region is really back on track?
So I believe you really have to look at what's going to happen with the pandemic. Some countries have not achieved the level of vaccination rates they need. and are still at risk for significant downside there. The global supply chain, so countries that are more reliant on that, and then access to capital, particularly if the inflationary environment crosses with the tapering in some of the more developed economies, could create problems for Latin America, parts of the Middle East, and Northern Africa in particular. I think Europe has shown that it's pretty steady. So even though the growth has been a bit slower overall than maybe the other two big blocks, it looks like it's doing pretty well going into next year. So those are probably the economies that I would be the most worried about.
Okay. Let's turn now a little bit more to the U.S. Mr. Walker, what do you see in terms of the U.S. status at this point? We've just heard that we are in pretty good shape, but that doesn't mean that every sector is in pretty good shape. What do you see as the sectors that are really leading and the ones where we perhaps need to be a bit more cautious?
Thank you, and I agree broadly with Frank's articulation. I think in the U.S. as in globally, obviously different sectors were hit disparately. Accommodations and food, recreational services, travel were crushed, whereas communications, technology, pharma, and others did well. I think. Importantly, we saw, just as there are different return rates in individual cities and regions around the country and around the world, the same, frankly, applies within individual sectors. So the Macy's versus Amazon example in the U.S., or, we saw restaurants being decimated around the country, while things like Open Table or Uber Eats are at almost 2 times their revenues pre-pandemic. So, I think you have to follow the path of the virus. I do think, that you see right now on the basis of the solid rebound, deep cyclicals sort of leading the way. Certainly in terms of versus earnings expectations, but we anticipate there's going to be continued solid growth, historically high inflation for us in a narrow sense, although we too see that reducing a little bit going forward. And so from a markets perspective, probably are focused a bit more on value versus growth, smaller companies versus larger companies, and the like.
So one of the sectors that you mentioned, and I think it's every city I've been in a few in the last few months, is facing a labor shortage, particularly in consumer-facing businesses like retail, like restaurants, and tourism not only took a big hit, but is also really faced. I'm in a hotel in Milwaukee right now, marvelous hotel, but they can't deliver your breakfast because there are not enough hands on deck. How do you see all of that playing out? Is that going to be a significant issue, not only in the U.S., but around the world?
I think it is, and we're again. I think you've got to look sort of beneath the surface, and it's really going to differ by country, by city, as you're experiencing in Milwaukee, and by activity. So, business travel, for example, a recent survey had 80% of U.S. companies still essentially saying there's going to be no international travel. Whereas half that are foreseeing significant reductions in domestic travel. If you look at airports across the U.S., I think we're back to about 80% of pre-pandemic levels. And if you look at search activity, you'll see in terms of people looking for holidays, we're actually on the other side in the U.S. Although if you look at places like the UK it's still down almost 50%, remarkably. So there are going to be they're important. There are staffing challenges that we all are experiencing around the country and around the world, and there are going to be disparate impacts depending upon which of those buckets, domestic, global, business, personal, one happens to have exposure to.
Okay, we're going to come back to a couple of these topics, but for right now, let's keep on moving. Mr. Bullard, obviously, a lot of these conditions are affected by government policy. Here you are in a unique position to look to know and see what's happening across the U.S. Do we think that inflation from where the Fed is sitting, is inflation a serious concern for the U.S.?
Well, thanks, Jana. Thanks for inviting me to this panel today. I think inflation is much higher than what we've experienced in the last decade, for sure. The committee, the Open Market Committee, on which I sit, adopted an inflation target in 2012, a little bit late to the international agreement on implicit agreements on setting an inflation target. And then we promptly missed our inflation target to the low side ever since we named it. So part of central banking is to be credible, to hit your inflation target, and then markets and consumers and businesses know what to expect with regard to inflation. So what has happened just in the last 6 months or so is that we've had an inflationary shock, a surprise to the upside on inflation. And now inflation, even if you strip out food and energy, on our preferred measure is running about 3.6%, well above our 2% inflation target. We haven't seen a number that high on inflation, on that measure of inflation, for 30 years. So quite the surprise. Last December, I and other members of the committee were only predicting about 1.8% for the whole year for inflation in 2021. So this is very much a surprise to the upside. And now this is a great debate, an important debate, I think, about how to handle this going forward. And I am concerned that the risks are to the upside, that we'll continue to get higher than anticipated inflation, that this high inflation will persist into 2022. It will dissipate somewhat, but not all the way back down to where we'd like it to be in 2022. I've actually penciled in 2.8% on core PC inflation for 2022. So it does look like we're going to have more inflation than we're used to for some time. And some of that's going to be making up for the past misses to the low side, but there are certainly risks to the upside that we get even more inflation than we are anticipating even right now.
So I want to talk a little bit about why inflation is going up. I'm personally not convinced from what I've seen that it's all as obvious as it appears. So we talk about food costs, we talk about energy, but I'm wondering how much the labor shortage is pushing that inflation rate, and whether or not, when I was young, and I think we're all about the same age here. When I was young, we thought that paying $10,000 for a car was an enormous sum. That's all changed dramatically. So have our salaries to match it. Are we talking about a scenario where salaries go up, prices go up, but they all stay pretty much in a balance factor? Or are we talking about a scenario that will really affect household ability to purchase?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. in a position now where we are seeing input costs go up for many businesses. And when I'm in forums like this and talk to people around the 8th Federal Reserve District here and across the country, they all say, you know, my business is facing higher costs. My business is facing unprecedented supply issues. I'm having to really scramble for labor. I'm raising wages. I'm offering bonuses, signing bonuses and retention bonuses in an effort to find workers. But then they turn around and typically say, don't worry, my company's going to be profitable because I'm going to raise prices, and we've had no difficulty raising prices in this environment. So that story sounds like the one you described, where you get inflation more entrenched than probably the Fed would like, and possibly at a higher level than the Fed would like. So I am concerned about the changing mentality, I would say, around prices in the economy, and the relative freedom that businesses feel that they can just pass on increased costs easily to their customers. For years, that's not been the case in U.S. They felt like if they raised prices, they would lose market share. It would hurt their business, and consumers were rabid about moving to the lower cost places or low cost products. So that may be breaking down. I don't think that's definitive at this point, but it is a concern, and that's a reason why there may be upside risk for the U.S. economy.
Let's turn for a moment. We'll come back to the U.S. economy. It's our home state, but because I live in Miami, I am considering Latin America as much home as the rest of the country. And so, Mr. Almagro, would you talk to us about the impacts that you are seeing, lingering impacts in Latin America, both of the pandemic, where the temperature, your view is, of our exit from the pandemic in Latin America, and what you see in the near future?
Yes, thank you very much. We have seen the largest contraction in 100 years in Latin America and the Caribbean. We suffered the worst average regional contraction ever, reaching 6.8% for 2020. The region is expected to grow 5.9% this year, barely recovering from the 2020 levels, in part, of course, to the rise of commodity price that is the main exports of Latin American countries. For 2022, the CLAC is forecasting an acceleration of to 2.9%. The problem is, usually the biggest problem is the social problem. Our vulnerabilities have all been exposed. Poverty increased by 29 million people, inequality worsened by 5%, considering pre-crisis level. Important segments of society do not have equal access to connectivity and the skills necessary for the digital economy. So small and medium companies have suffered a lot. Education suffered a lot. Women and minorities, youth and less skilled workers suffered a lot during this pandemic. And the problem is that because of unequal access to vaccines, we don't even know when this will be over. And so access to vaccination, as it was said, it is an important thing for Latin American countries these days. And the acceleration of the vaccination programs definitely will bring a change for the economy, better opportunities for the economy. But so far, we don't exactly know when will be the day after. We are still living during this, and access, of course, to the capital accumulation is never enough for Latin American countries. So we are dealing with this as good as we can, but we definitely will need capitalization or recapitalization of international financial institutions in order to to help Latin American countries during the pandemic times and after the pandemic times.
You brought up a very interesting and I think really important topic around inequality and impact. And in forums like this, we tend to talk at a fairly high level about concepts and how different systems work. But in fact, those systems are translated in people's lives into very individual circumstances. In recent years, Latin America in particular has, I think, grown beyond the traditional paradigm of immense inequalities and has narrowed that gap. What impact do you see this pandemic and the exit from this pandemic having on the historic inequalities?
Yes, it affected very much. We were very well, as I said, our vulnerabilities were completely exposed. Inequality was one of them, the most visible one maybe because we were already the most unequal region in the world. And we saw that that brought a lot of issues, the pandemic brought a lot of issues related to that. Imagine that we count for 8% of the world population, but we reached at a certain point at the level of 38, 39% of the COVID cases. And we almost reached 40% also of the victims of the pandemic. So the management of all this, of course, and the strength of the institutions was not enough to deal with a case like the pandemic, and we suffered a lot. And every sector suffered. I mean, and those that they were less skilled, those that their level of education was not so big, those that they didn't have a financial cushion, those that they didn't have enough social welfare, the informality of the economy that reaches practically 60% of the of Latin American economy was completely exposed during the pandemic, and that's why we suffered much more because of these structural problems that some of them they have at least 200 years, others they have some decades, no, but also exposed our societies more to organized crime, to the violence of organized crime. That is a pattern. I mean, we have also those structural problems in our society. So we definitely suffered a lot during the pandemic. We suffered a lot in victims. We suffered a lot in cases. Our health systems collapsed in many ways. And of course, there are different scenarios because not every country is the same in Latin America, but definitely we were affected as a hemisphere. And plus, there is something that distributes better than anything else in Latin America and the Caribbean countries, and it's substantial for Caribbean countries, that is tourism. And tourism completely collapsed during the pandemic. So our countries, and tourism has a net of distribution that is maybe the best that our economies may have. Practically everybody else receives something from tourism. But definitely was shocked by this pandemic and put all the economies in the region under serious stress because of that. So we feel that, of course, the tools that we need to recover are, of course, the financial accumulation that will depend mainly of the capacity that international institutions may have. Our human resources, as you know, they are not equally prepared. We have very well qualified human resources, but at the same time, we have very bad qualified human resources. So that is not equal at all, and creates a big gap, and the gap got bigger during this pandemic. And of course, the technology is innovation, and technology is we are not at the top of the world from Latin America, so it's something that we definitely we need to take profit and accelerate some engagement to have better conditions and and on these matters, but we are still far away, far behind, and that has been all this has been exposed during this pandemic. So the social, the economy may recover, as I said, practically it's recovering, growing practically just a few cents below what we were before the pandemic, 5.9 recovery due to, of course, commodity prices. But the impact on the social impact is different than the economy impact, and the economy may recover with a V, but the social impact will recover with a very wide U, and that is it means, of course, how people suffer the pandemic is a different thing than how economy suffers the pandemic.
I appreciate that viewpoint. Mr. Bullard, I'm going to draw you back in here for a second. Let's talk about, and I know the Fed has been concerned about this, the inequities that exist in Latin America. Are those also becoming increasingly evident in the U.S., or is the U.S. in a little bit more resilient condition?
Well, the U.S. is notorious for having very high income inequality, very high financial wealth inequality. I've actually, when I put on my research hat, I've got models about this. Are trying to push the research frontier forward and trying to give us ways to think about this. I think the pandemic is, a huge human tragedy. You've got many deaths around the world, and Latin America has been one of the hardest hit places, but North America as well. And so I agree with the idea that this is, this has a human side to it, a human impact. What also has happened, though, paradoxically, is that the economy has done well. And I would attribute a lot of that to the resilience of American management and just the ability to react to something big and something unprecedented, but still find a way to produce products, produce services, and households too. I would say they found ways to consume and to enjoy their lives despite the pandemic. They stayed away from goods and services that were high physical contact and moved toward goods that had less of that. And the net result is the astonishing finding that GDP, or national income, today is actually higher than before the pandemic hit, and the pandemic isn't really over. In fact, some of the numbers on the pandemic are at some of their peaks that we've seen. So how could that be that you have more output today, more national income today than if there was no pandemic at all? Well, that's because there's been so much adjustment and so much resilience in the U.S. economy. And not only that, it's not only higher than the previous peak in the U.S., but it's, according to standard forecast, it looks like we'll pass the previous trend line. So I would give a silver lining here about this, that despite the human tragedy of the pandemic, the economy itself has adjusted, and that means we're using new technologies in a way that we wouldn't have if we hadn't been forced to, punched in the face, let's say, by the pandemic. And that may lead to productivity improvements going forward that may be lasting. So you could have a higher productivity growth rate for the U.S. economy. It's been sluggish for the last decade, but we may now be switching to a situation where we have a higher productivity growth rate, therefore a higher long-run growth rate or medium-term growth rate for the U.S. economy. I think that would help tremendously in the U.S. if that's actually happening. And I think it would help our partners in Latin America and elsewhere around the world if we get somewhat faster growth in the U.S. The last time this happened was the late 1990s. And you had many years in a row of well above trend growth for the U.S. economy, and it did produce lots of improvement really across the economic spectrum. So I hope that, I put a little bit of hope here that something like that is happening with respect to the economy as we try to get this terrible pandemic under more control going forward.
So let me turn now to Mr. Holder. We have talked a bit about the downside of all of this. There are, and we've alluded a little bit to this, but we're going to move more into what we would call in my business solutions-based journalism, and look at what some of the opportunities are and what it takes to really take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. Mr. Almagro talked a little bit about, in Latin America, a need for debt relief. Mr. Holder, what do you see around the world? What are the opportunities and what needs to happen to make those opportunities more realistic?
So I think that clearly any situations like this one, whether it be a pandemic or recession that's fueled by some other reason, they always produce opportunities when you're coming out of it, right? And the question is sort of how do you take advantage of them, and for some economies, how do you avoid the pitfalls that come out of them? So one of the things that Luis mentioned earlier is he alluded to the concentration of wealth, right? The pandemic has in some ways accelerated this unevenness between countries and within countries in terms of those who have, it's the haves and the have-nots in terms of access to vaccines, access to capital, access to technology. And so one of the great opportunities that we have in the world is we've realized that we have a different way to connect with each other now. And that if we make the investments in the right kind of areas, we can actually be much more productive and more interconnected. So, the world had been moving towards decoupling in some cases, while at the same time being very tightly integrated in other ways. So there are opportunities there. There are opportunities to invest in technology. There are opportunities to invest in the supply chain. There are opportunities to look at the way we do business differently, and sort of recognize where these needs are and try and satisfy those needs. So the U.S. has a very strong capital market, right? Latin America needs access to capital and can't have the debt be so onerous that it's unable to develop. That's actually, it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity as well. And I think we see business traveling declining to an extent, but we also see other ways to connect with each other and other ways to transfer technology and to invest in growth. So within different businesses, you're going to see a move towards a new model, and the new post-pandemic. It's really becoming. You have to become accustomed to this environment that we live in, but it's created enormous upside. I mean, when you look at the growth of firms that are flexible and agile in their management and do have access to capital, they're having a wonderful year. We just have to figure out how to include more people within our countries and include more countries in that movement as a whole. But I see that as a great opportunity for those who are in a position to help out.
Well, let's stick with that thing for a minute, because at the moment I'm actually at a travel and tourism conference, this conversation notwithstanding. And clearly travel and tourism have been a path forward for many underdeveloped countries, as Mr. Almagro noted. And when travel and tourism really came to a standstill, that was a big hit in a lot of developing places. So I'm going to ask, and then you have just talked about the new ways to connect, but of course in many places that technology is not widely available. Yeah. So Mr. Holder, what do you think we need to do to move that agenda along? Can travel and tourism for an FIT client reemerge? Or do we need to distribute technological devices more widely? What's the next step here?
I think it's really both of those things, right? I mean, when you look at tourism is not going to go away. despite the pandemic, but we have to be very creative about the way we can put the right measures in place in order to salvage it. I mean, even for South Florida, the cruise industry is incredibly important, and it's been devastated by the pandemic. It will come back. The question is, what is the smart and innovative way to do it in a safe manner that will bring, people back? And sometimes the resources aren't there in the countries that need it the most. So those who have access to capital need to partner with the opportunity in those markets and try and make that happen. On the technology side, it's both more simple and more complicated. We already know what to do, it's just that it's really expensive. So earlier we heard the CEO of Verizon talk about, trying to really work on the cost side of 5G and broadband rollouts. I think that's incredibly important. We need to look for alternatives that are viable in markets that don't have access to the kind of capital that you have in the EU or in the US or even in China.
Mr. Walker, what's your view on the opportunity and what it takes to, for a variety of different places to take advantage of those opportunities?
Yeah, I'd say, first going back to the discussion on sort of income inequality, I do think we should also acknowledge that with all of the extraordinary, particularly monetary policy, assets, folks who had assets have done really well over the course of the past few years, and folks who haven't have struggled. I think, given where starting valuations are, if you wanted to make a bet over what's going to happen over the course of the next 10 years, I think, returns to assets, just given the starting place, are likely to be lower than we've experienced historically. And, we're all seeing the whether it's the lack of layoffs or that which you're experiencing in terms of food delivery at the hotel in Milwaukee. I think we'll see some positive moves in terms of income inequality over the course of the coming 5 years, at least from a cyclical perspective. And in terms of the other question about opportunity, I think for firms that have, as President Bullard said, who have sort of leaned into this, found new ways of doing business, have been creative, have been flexible, have benefited. And so I think it's beholden on each of us as stewards of organizations or of capital to continue to invest and change the way we've been operating historically, to think more flexibly about the nature of work and how we engage folks, to continue to invest in technology and the like. And I think companies that do that are going to be well positioned to prosper in an environment over the course of time that I think could be an exciting one. So you see it in every industry. If you look at what's happening in the automobile industry, for example, the way that General Motors is in the process of transforming itself is really quite staggering. And so firms that are leaning into this, I think will do well. And we're in a world where also as more and more investors are focused on how companies interact with the communities around them, with their customers, with their suppliers and the like, and are more focused on ESG considerations. Firms that take that seriously, I think, will reap disproportionate rewards to firms, frankly, that are laggards on that front.
So did you just tell me to move into fixed assets and fixed income versus my big equity plays? Was that what that was?
I didn't say that because you're not going to make much money in your fixed income portfolio for a period. I would tell you to probably shorten duration and increase credit risk in your fixed income portfolio, and then I would tell you to be very selective in your equity investing, and that you'll be rewarded by insightful security selection as opposed to necessarily just being a broad passive market participant in a way that everyone, frankly, has been rewarded for being in that position over the course of the past decade.
Thank you for that clarification. We all need a little help. Now, Mr. Bullard, let's go back to government policy. I think we all have become very much accustomed to the Fed being the keeper of our interest rates, as we've discussed. But what other policy can government consider to ease both our national picture, but also how we interact with others outside the country?
Yeah, well, I like to stick to interest rate policy, but I'll speculate a little bit here. I would say in the last few years, the trade policy has been front and center. Certainly the Trump administration emphasized trade policy. I think one of the untold stories of the new administration is that they really aren't altering the approach to trade, or they don't seem to be on a path to meaningfully alter the approach to trade that was pioneered by the previous administration. So I think, you know, as a distant observer of this, I would interpret that as the idea that there's a consensus has been formed between the two political parties that we needed to get tougher on trade, and we needed to make some changes, and that those changes are going to stick. It's here. The new party has come into control. They don't have that. They don't have reversing what the previous administration did at the top of their agenda on that dimension. I would say immigration policy is kind of similar. That was also a major issue for the previous administration. I'm not seeing a lot of change on that either. This has been a long-standing stalemate, I would say, in the U.S. Congress as what to do about immigration reform. And I'm not seeing that rising to the top of the agenda either, that let's get this resolved. I think we're going to continue with the policies that we had in place previously. Immigration doesn't sound like it's very close to macroeconomics, which is what I do, but it does matter because you have many people that would like to come to the U.S. You certainly like to have great talent on our team and working for us if we can get it. And some kind of immigration reform has been on the agenda at least since the 1980s. I can recall Alan Simpson, the senator from Wyoming, working on this in the late 1980s. He was unable to get anything done. So I think continued stalemate on that, unfortunately. And then, fiscal policy, I think, is something that hasn't been mentioned so far, but we've had extraordinary fiscal policy during the pandemic. And I think changing attitudes toward fiscal policy, the response to the pandemic, fiscally speaking, in March and April of 2020 was the keep households whole policy, which is that while the pandemic comes along, we have to tell workers that are in high physical contact industries, hey, you can't work during the pandemic, but don't worry, we're going to try our best to keep you whole, keep you able to pay your bills, pay your rent, as we're trying to figure out how to get past this pandemic. That policy worked and has been so successful that personal income, which is their income plus the transfers from the government, that is so high that it's above the pre-pandemic trend line. So we've actually you've got households on average, not every single household because we're missing some, because it's a big country and it's hard to get to everybody, but we did our best. And I think on average, we are above the pre-pandemic trend for personal income. And not only that, but about $3 trillion of that is still sitting in bank accounts around the country, and households haven't decided what to do with that. So we've got a lot of success, I would say, on that dimension that has prevented some aspects of the economy that would have atrophied or withered or been damaged during the last 18 months. It's allowed more resilience in the economy. It's allowed that to not happen, and that's putting us in great position going forward as we're coming out of the pandemic and bringing COVID-19 under better and better control going forward.